The gunshot echoed through the dusty valley as Knox Blackwell's bullet found its mark. A lone coyote had been threatening the flock, and he dispatched it with the cold efficiency that had made him one of the most feared men in Paso Robles, California. The year was 1875, and life in this growing town nestled between the coastal mountains and the dusty inland plains was unforgiving to those who showed weakness. "That's the third one this month," Knox muttered, lowering his Winchester rifle as the morning sun cast long shadows across the scrublands surrounding his ranch. At 32, his face was weathered by the California sun and hardened by years of struggle. His dark hair bore premature streaks of gray at the temples, testament to a life that had offered little mercy. Behind him, his foreman Miguel Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "Spring brings them down from the hills, senor. They are hungry, desperate." "Desperation makes things dangerous," Knox replied, his voice carrying no hint of compassion as he swung back onto his stallion. "Round up the men. The north fence needs mending before we lose any more livestock." Knox's Circle B ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime California ranchland. What had started as a humble homestead following his return from the Civil War had grown into one of the largest cattle operations in San Luis Obispo County. His success came from discipline, calculation, and an iron will that neither bent nor broke. But that success had come at a price. Knox Blackwell lived by a code that left no room for sentiment. His father's dying words still echoed in his mind. "Son, a man who lets his heart rule his head loses everything in the end." Knox had watched his father die penniless, having gambled away the family fortune on a woman who eventually abandoned him. It was a lesson Knox had carved into his soul. As he rode back toward the main house, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Squinting against the morning sun, he recognized the figure of Sheriff Thomas Wilkins. "Blackwell," the lawman called, reining his horse alongside Knox's. "Got trouble brewing in town." Knox's expression remained impassive. "Your troubles are not mine, Sheriff." "They are when they involve your water rights," Wilkins countered. "The new schoolteacher's stirring up sentiment against your dam on Paso Creek. Says you're diverting water the town needs." Knox's jaw tightened. "I've owned those water rights for 8 years, legally purchased. Legal don't always match up with right, according to some folks." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "There's a town meeting tonight. You might want to make an appearance." After the sheriff departed, Knox spent the day inspecting his property, thoughts of the town meeting simmering at the back of his mind. As sunset painted the western sky in fiery hues, he cleaned up, donned a fresh shirt, and rode into Paso Robles. The town had grown considerably in recent years. The discovery of hot springs had brought health seekers, and the expanding railroad had brought commerce. The meeting hall was packed when Knox entered, conversations dying as people noticed his presence. He took a seat near the back, acknowledging the few nods directed his way with a curt inclination of his head. Mayor Hollister called the meeting to order, droning through various town matters before addressing the issue that had drawn the crowd. "And now, I'd like to introduce our new schoolteacher, Miss Grace Sullivan, who has some concerns about the town's water supply." Knox's attention sharpened as a woman rose from the front row. She was not what he had expected. Tall and slender, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical but becoming style, she moved with confidence to the center of the room. Her dress was simple but well-made, suggesting Eastern origins. What struck him most, however, were her eyes clear and determined, sweeping across the room until they found him. "Thank you, Mayor Hollister," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I've been in Paso Robles for only 3 weeks, But in that time, I've observed a troubling situation. The creek that should supply water to the southern part of town runs nearly dry most days, while Mr. Blackwell's dam diverts the flow to his ranch. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Children are falling ill from poor water quality, and families are struggling to maintain their gardens and livestock, she continued. I understand Mr. Blackwell purchased these water rights legally, but surely there can be a compromise that serves both his interests and the town's. Knox stood slowly, drawing all eyes to him. Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice measured and cold, I purchased those rights fair and square when nobody else saw their value. I've invested considerable money developing that dam. Your recent arrival hardly qualifies you to judge matters you don't understand. Grace Sullivan met his gaze unflinchingly. I understand thirsty children and struggling families, Mr. Blackwell. Does your legal right outweigh their needs? Sentiment doesn't water cattle or grow crops, he replied. This is the West, Miss Sullivan. Resources go to those with the foresight to secure them. And what of community, Mr. Blackwell? Does that mean nothing? Knox scoffed. Community is just a pretty word people use when they want something for nothing. The room erupted in heated discussion. Knox noticed several of the townspeople who nodded respectfully to him on the street, and happily took his business now avoided his gaze or openly glared. Mayor Hollister finally restored order. Perhaps we can form a committee to discuss possible solutions. Mr. Blackwell, would you be willing to meet with Miss Sullivan and others to explore options? Before Knox could refuse, Grace Sullivan spoke. I would be happy to visit Mr. Blackwell's ranch to see his operation firsthand. Perhaps understanding each other's positions better would help us find common ground. Trapped by her reasonable tone and the expectant stares of the townspeople, Knox found himself nodding curtly. Saturday, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. Without waiting for a response, he strode from the hall. The ride home did nothing to improve his mood. The schoolteacher's challenge rankled him, not least because a small part of him recognized the justice in her argument. But he had built his life on hard decisions and calculated risks. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Saturday dawned clear and hot. Knox rose before sunrise as usual, completing several hours of work before instructing Miguel to show Miss Sullivan around when she arrived. He had no intention of playing tour guide himself. At precisely 10 o'clock, a buggy approached the main house. Knox watched from his office window as Grace Sullivan handled the reins with surprising skill. She wore a practical riding skirt and jacket, her auburn hair partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat against the California sun. Miguel greeted her, but to Knox's annoyance, she looked toward the house. Spotting him in the window, she offered a small wave. Cursing under his breath, Knox realized he couldn't avoid her without appearing cowardly. Miss Sullivan, he said stiffly, stepping onto the porch. You're punctual, at least. A necessary quality for a teacher, she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you for agreeing to this visit. I don't recall having much choice, he retorted. Miguel will show you the ranch. Actually, Mr. Blackwell, I'd prefer to hear from you directly. This is your operation, after all. Knox considered refusing but recognized the determination in her gaze. Very well. We'll start with the dam. Over the next 2 hours, Knox led Grace across his property, explaining his water management system, breeding program, and the economic realities of running a large ranch. Despite himself, he found her questions thoughtful and informed. She listened attentively, occasionally challenging his assertions but never dismissively. As they approached the dam that was the source of contention, Knox pointed out the extensive work he'd done to create a reliable water supply. Before I built this, The creek ran wild in spring and dried up by summer's end, he explained. Now it's regulated, providing consistent water year-round. Grace studied the structure. It's impressive engineering, she acknowledged. But couldn't a series of smaller dams serve both your needs and allow more water downstream to the town? Knox frowned. That would cost thousands and reduce my supply. Perhaps, she conceded, but it would also generate considerable goodwill. The people of Paso Robles want to respect your rights, Mr. Blackwell, but they need to survive too. Goodwill doesn't pay expenses, Miss Sullivan. She turned to face him fully, squinting slightly in the midday sun. No, but neither does hostility. You've built something remarkable here, but you've done it in isolation. A man needs allies, Mr. Blackwell, especially in times of hardship. I've managed well enough on my own. Grace smiled sadly. Have you? You have a beautiful ranch, but I don't see much joy in it or in you. Knox stiffened. I didn't invite you here for personal observations. No, you invited me to find a solution to our water dispute. I'm suggesting that the solution might benefit you in ways beyond mere water rights. Before Knox could respond, Miguel galloped up, his expression urgent. Senor Blackwell, fire in the east pasture. The men are trying to contain it, but the wind is spreading it fast. Knox's mind shifted immediately to action. Get the water wagons, round up every available hand, he turned to Grace. Your visit is over, Miss Sullivan. To his surprise, she was already untying her horse from the hitching post. I'm coming with you. This isn't your concern. A wildfire threatens everyone in the valley. I'm coming. Without waiting for permission, she swung into the saddle with practiced ease. Knox had no time to argue. He mounted his own horse and galloped toward the rising plume of smoke, aware of Grace keeping pace behind him. The scene at the east pasture was chaos. A section of dry grassland was ablaze, the flames leaping higher as the wind gusted. Ranch hands formed a desperate line, beating at the edges of the fire with wet blankets while others tried to dig a fire break. The creek's too low to get enough water, shouted his foreman. Knox surveyed the situation quickly. The fire was spreading toward a stand of oaks where 100 head of cattle were penned. Beyond that lay the Winchester Ranch, and beyond that, the outskirts of town itself. We need to start a backfire, Knox shouted, already calculating where to set it. The wind's too unpredictable. Miguel warned. It's our only chance to save the herd. Grace rode up beside them, her face streaked with soot. The school children, she exclaimed. They're on a nature study at the creek just beyond those trees. Knox's stomach dropped. How many? 15 with Mrs. Abernathy. Knox made a split-second decision. Miguel, take 5 men and set the backfire where we planned. Miss Sullivan, show me where the children are. They rode hard through the smoke-filled air, circling wide around the advancing flames. Knox's throat burned and his eyes watered, but he pressed on, following Grace's lead. They found the children huddled by the creek, their teacher trying valiantly to keep them calm as smoke billowed over the ridge above them. Mrs. Abernathy, Grace called. We need to move the children immediately. The older woman looked up, relief washing over her frightened face. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Blackwell. Knox quickly assessed their situation. The main fire hadn't reached them yet, but their escape route back to town was already cut off. We'll take them to my ranch, he decided. It's closest, and we can cross at the dam. Together, they organized the children quickly. The youngest rode double with adults, while the older ones walked in pairs, each holding a dampened handkerchief over their face. Knox led the way, choosing a path through the smoky terrain with Grace bringing up the rear to ensure no child was left behind. When a small boy stumbled, exhausted and frightened, Knox swung down without hesitation. lifting the child onto his horse before remounting behind him. "I'm scared, mister," the boy whispered. "You'll be all right, son," Knox replied, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Just hold on to the saddle horn." As they crossed the dam, Knox saw with relief that the backfire was working, containing the main blaze away from his buildings and corrals. Miguel and the ranch hands had managed to save most of the livestock, though he could see several injured animals being tended to. By nightfall, the fire was under control, though patches still smoldered across the eastern pasture. The children had been fed and bedded down in the bunkhouse, with Mrs. Abernathy watching over them. Parents would come for them in the morning, once the roads were safe again. Knox found Grace on his porch, staring out at the orange glow still visible on the distant hillside. Her face and clothes were smudged with soot, her hair falling loose from its pins, yet there was a quiet dignity in her exhaustion. "You handled yourself well today," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. She accepted it with a grateful nod. "As did you, particularly with young Tommy Henderson. He hasn't stopped talking about how the big rancher saved him." Knox shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps." Grace sipped her coffee. "But not everyone would have risked their property to save a neighbor's children. The fire would have reached my land eventually." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "You don't accept gratitude easily, do you, Mr. Blackwell?" "Knox," he said suddenly. "My name is Knox." A small smile curved her lips. "Knox, then, and I'm Grace." A moment of silence stretched between them, oddly comfortable despite the day's chaos. "The fire started at the edge of Winchester's property," Knox said finally. "Probably a campfire left by drifters." "It could have been much worse," Grace observed, "if you hadn't acted quickly with that backfire." Knox nodded, his gaze drawn back to the smoldering hillside. "I'll lose about 50 acres of grazing land, but it'll recover by next spring." "And the water situation?" she asked quietly. Knox sighed, the events of the day having shifted something fundamental inside him. "I've been thinking about your suggestion. Smaller dams might work, especially if we redesign the irrigation system." Grace's expression brightened. "You'd consider it?" "I'm not making any promises," he cautioned, "but I'll have my engineer look into it. That's all I ask." She set down her empty cup. "Thank you." Later that night, after Grace had retired to the guest room and the ranch had settled into an exhausted quiet, Knox stood on his porch, contemplating the day's events. He'd always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, on needing no one. Yet today, he'd witnessed the power of people working together, of community. And he couldn't deny that something about Grace Sullivan had gotten under his skin: her courage, her principles, her unwavering gaze that seemed to see past his carefully constructed walls. Knox Blackwell had spent years believing that emotional attachments were weaknesses to be avoided at all costs. But as he finally sought his bed, the image of Grace riding fearlessly through smoke and flame stayed with him, challenging everything he thought he knew about strength and vulnerability. In the week following the fire, Knox found himself thinking about Grace Sullivan far more often than he cared to admit. The children had been safely returned to their families, the fire damage assessed, and life had ostensibly returned to normal. Yet something had changed. Knox had sent for James Wilson, an engineer from San Francisco who had helped design his original dam. The man arrived on Wednesday's stage, and Knox wasted no time outlining the situation. "Multiple smaller dams, you say?" Wilson mused, examining the map spread across Knox's desk. "It's possible, certainly. More labor-intensive and initially more costly, but potentially more efficient in the long run. And it would allow more water downstream to the town." Wilson nodded. "If designed correctly, yes. We could create a regulated flow that serves both purposes. It's quite progressive thinking, actually. Knox didn't mention that the idea had come from Grace. The following day, Knox rode into town, ostensibly to purchase supplies and mail Wilson's preliminary sketches to his office in San Francisco. If his path happened to take him past the schoolhouse as classes were letting out, he told himself it was merely coincidence. Children streamed from the white clapboard building, their voices rising in the afternoon air. Knox remained on horseback at a distance, scanning the scene until he spotted Grace standing on the steps, bidding farewell to her pupils. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned, looking every inch the proper schoolteacher. Then young Tommy Henderson spotted him. "Mr. Blackwell." The boy shouted, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Blackwell." Other children turned to look, and Knox found himself the center of attention, exactly the situation he typically avoided. Grace looked up, surprise evident on her face before it transformed into a warm smile. With no choice but to acknowledge the greeting, Knox touched the brim of his hat and nudged his horse forward. "Mr. Blackwell," Grace said as he approached, "what brings you to town?" "Business," he replied curtly, then, seeing her smile falter, added, "and I wanted to inform you that I've consulted an engineer about the water situation." Her expression brightened immediately. "You have? That's wonderful news. It's preliminary," he cautioned. "The costs may be prohibitive." "But you're considering it. That's more than many thought possible." Her green eyes held his with that directness he was coming to expect and perhaps appreciate. "Would you like to discuss it further? I was about to have tea at Mrs. Foster's bakery." Knox hesitated. Tea at the bakery meant being seen in public with the schoolteacher, inviting speculation and gossip. Yet the prospect of spending more time in Grace's company was unexpectedly appealing. "Very well," he found himself saying. "I'll stable my horse and meet you there." Mrs. Foster's bakery was a Paso Robles institution, known for both its sourdough bread and as the center of town gossip. Conversations paused briefly when Knox entered and made his way to the corner table, where Grace waited. She had removed her bonnet, revealing the full glory of her auburn hair twisted into a neat chignon. "I took the liberty of ordering for us," she said as he sat down. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," he replied, aware of the surreptitious glances from other patrons. Mrs. Foster herself bustled over, placing a pot of tea and a plate of cinnamon rolls before them. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her tone suggesting barely contained curiosity. "Lovely to see you both." "Thank you, Mrs. Foster," Grace replied pleasantly. "Mr. Blackwell and I are discussing water management." "Of course you are, dear," Mrs. Foster said with a knowing smile before returning to her counter. "You've set the town talking," Knox observed dryly once the woman was out of earshot. Grace poured tea for them both. "People will always talk. It's human nature. Sugar?" "No, thank you." He watched as she added a small spoonful to her own cup. "The engineer believes your idea has merit." Her eyes lit up. "Does he? I'm glad to hear it." "It won't be simple or cheap," Knox continued. "And construction would disrupt water flow temporarily. But the long-term benefits would be substantial," she countered, "for both your ranch and the town." Knox nodded reluctantly. "Potentially, yes, but I'm still not convinced the expense is justified." Grace considered him thoughtfully. "What if the town contributed to the cost? A community project of sorts. Most folks around here aren't exactly flush with cash." "No, but they have skills. Carpentry, stonework, labor. If people contributed what they could—" "Charity," Knox interrupted, his tone dismissive. "I don't need handouts." "It's not charity to work together for mutual benefit," Grace argued. "It's partnership." That word hung between them, carrying implications beyond water rights and dam construction. Knox found himself studying her face, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her green eyes, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose visible only at this close distance. "You're not what I expected, Miss Sullivan." Her lips curved into a small smile. "Grace," she corrected. "And what did you expect? Someone less?" He searched for the right word. "Formidable." She laughed then, a clear, genuine sound that drew even more curious glances. "I'll take that as a compliment, Knox." The way she said his name with that hint of Eastern accent did strange things to his equilibrium. Knox cleared his throat and reached for his tea, using the moment to regain his composure. "Where did you learn about water management?" he asked. "It's hardly standard curriculum for schoolteachers." "My father was a civil engineer in Pennsylvania," she explained. "He specialized in canal systems and water control. I grew up reading his technical journals and accompanying him to project sites." "Yet you became a teacher instead of an engineer." Grace's expression turned wistful. "Women aren't exactly welcomed in engineering, but education, that's a field where I can make a difference." She paused, then added, "After my parents died in a typhoid outbreak, I decided I needed a fresh start. The advertisement for a teacher in Paso Robles seemed like fate." "I'm sorry about your parents," Knox said, surprised by his own sincerity. "Thank you." She studied him over her teacup. "And your family?" Knox stiffened slightly. "My mother died when I was young. My father lost everything chasing after a woman who didn't love him. He died broke and broken." "That must have been difficult for you." "It taught me a valuable lesson about the dangers of sentiment." Grace's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps the lesson wasn't that love itself is dangerous, but that it must be given wisely to someone worthy of it." Knox didn't respond. The conversation had veered into territory too personal, too close to the carefully guarded chambers of his heart. Seeming to sense his discomfort, Grace changed the subject. "Tell me about your time during the war. You served, didn't you?" The rest of their tea passed in less treacherous conversation. Knox found himself sharing stories of his experiences during the Civil War that he rarely discussed with anyone. Grace listened attentively, asking perceptive questions and offering insights of her own about the war's impact on her Pennsylvania hometown. By the time they left the bakery, the sun was low in the western sky, casting long shadows down Paso Robles Main Street. Knox insisted on escorting Grace to her small cottage near the schoolhouse. "Thank you for the tea," he said stiffly as they reached her gate. "Thank you for considering the dam proposal," she replied. "And for the company. It's been some time since I've had such engaging conversation." Knox found himself reluctant to leave. "Perhaps we could continue our discussion of the project. There are still many details to work out." Grace smiled. "I'd like that. Sunday after church, we could have lunch." The invitation caught him off guard. "I don't attend church." "The lunch invitation stands regardless," she said easily. 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock, he agreed, tipping his hat before turning to leave. As Knox rode back to his ranch in the gathering dusk, he realized with some alarm that he was looking forward to Sunday with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. Grace Sullivan was dangerous not in the way he had initially assumed, but in how effortlessly she challenged his long-held convictions about self-reliance and emotional distance. Knox Blackwell had built his life and his success on the principle that attachments were liabilities. Yet for the first time in memory, he found himself questioning whether isolation was truly strength or merely another kind of weakness. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wild sage across the hills. Knox spent the morning in a state of uncharacteristic distraction, changing his shirt twice, before settling on a dark blue one that Miguel's wife once mentioned brought out the color of his eyes. He told himself it was merely proper respect for a social call, nothing more. He arrived at Grace's cottage precisely at 1 o'clock, a bottle of decent California wine in hand. Her home was small but well kept, with a neat garden of native plants and herbs bordering the walkway. Knox had barely knocked when the door swung open. "You're punctual," Grace said, echoing his words from their first meeting at his ranch. "A necessary quality for a rancher," he replied, completing the callback with the hint of a smile. She wore a simple dress of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged more casually than he'd seen before, with soft tendrils framing her face. The effect was striking, transforming the prim schoolteacher into a woman of quiet but undeniable beauty. "Please come in," she invited, stepping aside. "I hope you're hungry. I may have overestimated how much food two people can eat." The interior of Grace's cottage was modest but warm, filled with books and small personal touches that spoke of an educated mind and refined taste. The dining table was indeed laden with an impressive spread of roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and an apple pie cooling on the windowsill. "You didn't need to go to such trouble," Knox said, suddenly feeling awkward with the wine bottle in his hand. "Cooking relaxes me," she replied, taking the wine with a smile of thanks. "Besides, after a week of teaching, I enjoy having an adult conversation partner." The meal progressed pleasantly, their discussion ranging from local matters to national politics to literature. Knox was surprised to discover that Grace shared his appreciation for Shakespeare and Thoreau, though they disagreed good-naturedly on the merits of Whitman's more controversial poems. "I still can't believe the school board approved your teaching Leaves of Grass," Knox remarked as they moved to Grace's small sitting area with cups of coffee. "They haven't examined my reading list too closely," she admitted with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Besides, education should challenge conventions, not merely reinforce them. A dangerous philosophy in a town like Paso Robles, perhaps, but necessary for progress." She curled into the corner of her settee, regarding him thoughtfully. "You're an educated man, Knox." "That's somewhat unusual for ranchers in these parts. My mother insisted I receive a proper education before she died. I spent 2 years at a university back east before the war intervened. And after," Knox's expression darkened slightly, "after the war, I had no stomach for academic debates. I wanted something tangible, something I could build with my own hands." "Your ranch," Grace nodded. "You've built something impressive." "At considerable cost," he added quietly. She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Not just financial costs, I think." Knox shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "The dam project," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "Wilson's final plans should arrive next week. If they're satisfactory, we could begin construction before the dry season sets in fully." Grace allowed the deflection. "Have you considered my suggestion about community involvement?" "I've given it some thought," he conceded. "It has practical merit." Her face brightened. "Mayor Hollister would be eager to discuss it. Perhaps we could present the idea at the next town meeting." Knox raised an eyebrow. "People trust you for your business acumen, but they're wary of your motives," Grace explained diplomatically. "They trust me because of my position. Together we make a more convincing case." "A partnership," Knox said, recalling her words from the bakery. "Exactly." Her smile was warm, inviting his agreement. Something shifted in the air between them, a moment of connection that transcended their discussion of dams and water rights. Knox found himself noticing details he'd previously overlooked. The small scar near her left eyebrow, the way her hands moved expressively as she spoke, the subtle floral scent that surrounded her. The mantel clock chimed 4 times, breaking the spell. "I should go," Knox said, rising abruptly. "I have matters to attend to at the ranch." Grace stood as well, disappointment briefly crossing her features before she masked it with a polite smile. "Of course, thank you for coming. The company was most welcome." At the door, Knox paused. "The town meeting is Thursday." "Yes, 7 o'clock. "I'll be there," he promised. "We can present the dam proposal together." Her smile returned, genuine this time. "I look forward to it." As Knox rode home through the golden late afternoon light, he found himself reflecting on the afternoon with unusual clarity. Grace Sullivan was becoming dangerous to his peace of mind in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her intelligence, her principles, her quiet confidence all combined to create a woman unlike any he had known. And for the first time in years, Knox felt the protective walls around his heart developing hairline cracks. The realization should have sent him retreating to safer ground. Instead, he found himself wondering what it might mean to let those walls crumble entirely. Thursday's town meeting drew the largest crowd in recent memory. Word had spread that Knox Blackwell and the schoolteacher had developed a solution to the water dispute, and curiosity had brought out even those who typically avoided civic matters. Knox arrived early dressed in his best suit, the engineer's plans rolled carefully under his arm. He found Grace waiting outside the meeting hall, nervously adjusting her shawl. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, approaching her. She looked up, relief crossing her features. "I was afraid you might have changed your mind." "I gave my word," he replied simply. "Yes," she smiled. "I'm learning that means something substantial when it comes from you." They entered together, causing a momentary hush as the assembled townspeople observed them. Mayor Hollister waved them forward to the front of the hall. "Ah, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Blackwell, we're eager to hear your proposal." After the mayor handled various minor town matters, he finally called them forward. Knox let Grace begin, watching as she captivated the audience with her clear explanation of the water problems and the engineering principles behind the proposed solution. "And now," she concluded, "Mr. Blackwell will explain how this project can become a reality through community partnership." Knox stepped forward, unrolling the engineer's plans on the table for all to see. With a businesslike precision, he outlined the costs, the timeline, and the benefits to both his ranch and the town. "This represents a considerable investment," he acknowledged. "One that would ordinarily be beyond my willingness to undertake solely for the benefit of providing additional water downstream." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some disapproving. "However," Knox continued, meeting the gazes of those assembled, "Miss Sullivan has proposed an arrangement that might serve all our interests. I will finance the materials and professional engineering required. In return, I ask for the town's contribution of labor and skills." "So you want free work?" called out Frank Miller, the blacksmith. "Not free," Knox corrected. "In exchange for guaranteed water rights for the town in perpetuity, legally documented and binding on any future owner of my property." A surprised silence fell over the assembly. "Furthermore," Knox added, "I propose establishing a committee of townspeople to oversee water allocation during drought years, ensuring fair distribution between agricultural and town needs." Mayor Hollister looked stunned. "That's remarkably generous, Mr. Blackwell." "It's not generosity," Knox replied firmly. "It's good business and good citizenship. We all prosper together, or we all suffer separately." From the corner of his eye, Knox saw Grace watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, something beyond mere approval, something that made his heart beat faster despite himself. The discussion that followed was animated but constructive. By meeting's end, a committee had been formed to organize the labor contributions, and a date set to begin preliminary work on the first of the new dams. As people filed out, many stopped to shake Knox's hand or offer words of appreciation, gestures that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. It was a novel experience, this sense of community approval, and Knox found it unexpectedly satisfying. "You were magnificent," Grace said when they finally had a moment alone. "I knew you could convince them, but I never expected you to offer so much." "Your influence," Knox admitted. "You've made me see certain things differently." Her eyes searched his. "Such as the value of cooperation, of connection." The last word came hesitantly, laden with meaning beyond the immediate context. A faint blush colored Grace's cheeks. "I'm glad," Mayor Hollister interrupted before Knox could respond. "A celebration is in order. Everyone's heading to the saloon for drinks. You'll both join us, I hope." Knox rarely socialized in town, preferring the isolation of his ranch. But tonight, with Grace looking at him expectantly, he found himself nodding. For a short while. The saloon was crowded and boisterous, the piano player pounding out lively tunes as townspeople celebrated what many were already calling a historic agreement. Knox found himself at the center of attention, a position that would normally have made him retreat, but with Grace beside him, it felt almost comfortable. "Dance with me," she said impulsively when the music shifted to a waltz. Knox stiffened. "I don't dance." "Everyone dances," she countered. "Some just need more practice than others." Before he could protest further, she had taken his hand and led him to the small, cleared area serving as a dance floor. Knox hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes upon them, but Grace simply placed his hand at her waist and took the other in hers. "Follow my lead," she whispered, "just this once." Tentatively, Knox began to move, finding to his surprise that his body remembered the steps taught in his youth. Grace was light in his arms, her movements graceful and assured. As they circled the floor, the room seemed to fade around them until there was only the music, the rhythm of their steps, and the warm pressure of her hand in his. "See," Grace murmured, looking up at him with sparkling eyes. "Not so terrible after all." "Not terrible at all," he agreed softly. When the music ended, Knox realized they were standing closer than propriety strictly allowed. Reluctantly, he stepped back, but kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary. "I should get you home," he said, his voice rough with emotions he wasn't ready to name. The night air was cool after the warmth of the saloon. They walked in companionable silence, Knox escorting Grace through the darkened streets with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "It's strange," Grace said as they approached her cottage. "A month ago, you were the forbidding rancher everyone feared, and I was determined to challenge you for the sake of the town. And now," Knox asked quietly, she looked up at him, her face silvered by moonlight. "Now I see the man beneath the reputation, someone principled and intelligent. Someone who cares more than he lets on." Knox felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see through the carefully constructed defenses of years. "You give me too much credit." "I don't think so." They had reached her door, but neither moved to end the evening. "You've surprised everyone, Knox. Perhaps even yourself." "You're the surprise, Grace," he admitted. "You've made me question certainties I've lived by for years." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm still deciding." In the moonlight, with her face upturned to his, Knox felt an overwhelming urge to kiss her. The realization sent a jolt of something like panic through him. He stepped back abruptly, breaking the moment. "Good night, Grace," he said formally. "I'll send word when Wilson arrives to begin the survey." A flicker of disappointment crossed her features, but she nodded. "Good night," Knox, and thank you for tonight, all of it." He waited until she was safely inside before turning away, his emotions in turmoil. The evening had revealed too much to Grace, to the townspeople, and worst of all, to himself. Knox Blackwell, who had built his life on emotional control and self-reliance, was developing feelings for the schoolteacher that threatened everything he thought he knew about himself. As he rode home under the stars, Knox wondered if he was making the same mistake his father had, letting his heart overrule his head. Yet something told him Grace Sullivan was nothing like the woman who had destroyed his father. She was honest, principled, strong in her own quiet way. And that, perhaps, was what frightened him most of all. Construction on the first of the new dams began the following week. True to their word, the townspeople turned out in force: carpenters, stoneworkers, and laborers working alongside Knox's ranch hands under Wilson's expert direction. Knox himself worked as hard as any man, stripping off his shirt in the June heat to haul stones and set forms for the concrete. Grace visited the site regularly, ostensibly to document the project for the school records. Knox couldn't help noticing how her gaze lingered when she thought he wasn't looking, or the faint color that rose in her cheeks when he approached her, still damp with honest sweat from the day's labor. "The children are fascinated by the project," she told him one evening as they stood watching the sunset from the partially completed dam. "I'm thinking of bringing my older students for a lesson on water engineering." "They'd be welcome," Knox replied. "Wilson enjoys an audience for his technical explanations." "And you?" Grace asked, turning to study his profile. "Are you pleased with how things are progressing?" Knox surveyed the site, noting the solid foundation already in place and the camaraderie that had developed among the workers. "It's proceeding faster than I expected. The town has contributed more than I anticipated. People accomplish remarkable things when united by a common purpose, so it seems." Knox hesitated, then added, "I've never worked well with others, always preferred to rely on myself. And now—" He met her gaze directly. "Now I'm beginning to see certain advantages too. Collaboration." The word hung between them, laden with implications beyond the dam project. Grace's expression softened, and for a moment, Knox thought she might reach for his hand. Instead, she looked back at the sunset, a small smile playing on her lips. "Progress indeed, Mr. Blackwell." As summer deepened, work continued on the dam project. What had begun as a pragmatic solution to a water dispute had transformed into something more, a symbol of new cooperation between Knox's ranch and Paso Robles. Knox found himself increasingly involved in town affairs, attending meetings, and even accepting dinner invitations from prominent citizens who had previously kept their distance. Through it all, Grace remained a constant presence, her quiet intelligence and unwavering principles challenging him to become more than the isolated, hard man he had been. Their friendship deepened through long conversations about books, politics, and philosophy, conversations that often continued late into the evening on her porch or in his study. Knox was careful never to cross the line into explicit courtship, though he suspected the entire town was speculating about their relationship. Grace never pressed him, seemingly content with their growing closeness while respecting his reticence, until the incident at Mendoza Creek. The first dam was nearly complete, and Wilson had moved his operations to the second site when a summer thunderstorm swept through the valley. The sudden downpour turned normally docile streams into raging torrents. Knox and his men were securing livestock when Miguel galloped up, his expression grave. "The schoolhouse, senor. The creek has overflowed its banks. Miss Sullivan and some children are trapped." Knox didn't hesitate. "Get ropes and the strongest horses," he shouted, already running for his stallion. They rode hard through the pelting rain, arriving at the schoolhouse to find a desperate situation. Mendoza Creek, normally a gentle stream behind the school, had become a churning river that had already undermined part of the building's foundation. Grace and 5 children, evidently staying late for extra lessons, were visible at the upper windows, the lower floor already beginning to flood. Sheriff Wilkins was attempting to organize a rescue. "Blackwell," he called in relief. "Thank God. The bridge is gone, and we can't get a rope across the current." Knox surveyed the scene with the same calculating eye that had served him in battle. "We'll use the tall oak," he decided, pointing to a massive tree whose branches extended partially over the creek. "I'll cross with a rope and secure a line." "It's too dangerous," the sheriff protested. "That current would sweep away a horse and rider in seconds." "Then I'll go through the tree," Knox replied, already stripping off his coat and gun belt. Before anyone could argue further, Knox was climbing the massive oak, moving with a surety that belied his size. Reaching the furthest solid branch that extended over the water, he tied one end of a rope around his waist and threw the coil to Miguel. "When I reach the schoolhouse, secure this end to the wagon," he called down. Then, without hesitation, he swung out over the raging water. The distance was too great to make it in one attempt. Knox dropped into the churning creek halfway across, the freezing water slamming into him with stunning force. For a terrifying moment, he was completely submerged, tumbled by the current. Then his training took over, and he fought his way to the surface, striking out with powerful strokes toward the partially submerged schoolhouse. Grace had seen him. She was at the window, her face pale with fear as she watched his struggle against the current. The sight of her gave Knox a surge of strength, and with a final effort he reached the building, grasping a windowsill with numb fingers. "Knox!" Grace cried, leaning out dangerously to help pull him inside. "The rope," he gasped, dragging himself through the window. "We'll use it to get everyone across." The children were huddled in the corner, wide-eyed and frightened. Knox recognized Tommy Henderson among them, the boy he'd carried during the fire. "Mr. Blackwell's here to save us," Tommy announced with perfect childish confidence. "That's right," Knox affirmed, checking that the rope was secure. "But we need to hurry. The building isn't stable." As if to emphasize his point, a loud crack echoed through the room as more of the foundation gave way. The entire structure shuddered. Working quickly, Knox devised a harness from school belts and straps from Grace's desk. "We'll send the smallest child first," he instructed, securing the makeshift harness around little Mary Porter. "Miguel and the men will pull her across, then the next and the next." "I'm scared," Mary whimpered as Knox lifted her to the window. "Look at me," he said gently, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "I promised your mother I'd bring you home safe. Have I ever broken a promise?" The child shook her head solemnly. "And I won't start now," Knox assured her. "Just hold tight to the rope and look at the men waiting for you, not at the water." One by one, they sent the children across, the men on shore pulling steadily on the rope while Knox supervised each crossing from the window. When only he and Grace remained, another ominous crack echoed through the building. "Your turn," Knox said, reaching for the harness. Grace shook her head. "You go first. I'm lighter, the building will hold me longer." "This isn't a negotiation," Knox growled. "Get in the harness." "No." Her green eyes flashed with the same determination he'd seen at their first meeting. "I won't leave while you're still in danger." The building shifted again, more dramatically this time. Water was now pouring through cracks in the floor. There was no time for arguments. "Together then," Knox decided, modifying the harness to hold them both. "It's risky, but the rope should hold." Grace nodded, allowing him to secure her against his side, their bodies pressed together by necessity. "Ready," she whispered. Knox signaled the men, and they began the precarious journey across the churning water. The ropes sagged dangerously under their combined weight, lowering them closer to the raging current than Knox had hoped. Halfway across, the schoolhouse behind them collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a surge of water that soaked them both. Grace clung to him, her face pressed against his shoulder, but she made no sound of fear. Knox held her tightly with one arm while keeping a death grip on the rope with the other, his muscles burning with the effort. When they finally reached the shore, willing hands pulled them to safety. Knox held Grace a moment longer than necessary, reluctant to break the connection forged in their shared peril. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes that reflected more than mere gratitude. Something broke loose inside Knox's carefully guarded heart. Without thinking, without calculating consequences, he lowered his head and kissed her a brief, fierce claiming that left them both breathless when he pulled away. Realizing what he'd done, Knox stepped back abruptly. "Forgive me," he muttered, turning away to hide the turmoil in his expression. That was inappropriate, but Grace caught his arm, turning him back to face her. "No," she said softly. It was long overdue. Before Knox could respond, they were surrounded by grateful parents and concerned townspeople. The moment passed, but something fundamental had changed between them, a boundary crossed that could never be re-established. That night, alone in his study with a glass of whiskey, Knox confronted the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He was falling in love with Grace Sullivan. The realization brought not joy but a cold fear that squeezed his chest like an iron band. Love had destroyed his father, reduced a once proud man to a broken shell. Knox had sworn never to give anyone such power over him. Yet here he was, contemplating the very vulnerability he had spent his adult life avoiding. Grace deserved better than a man who couldn't give his whole heart without reservation. She deserved someone who could love freely, without the shadows of old fears darkening every tender moment. By dawn, Knox had made his decision. He would withdraw from the dam project, citing business concerns. He would limit his interactions with Grace to necessary public functions. He would protect himself and her from the inevitable pain that would come from pursuing what had blossomed between them. It was the logical choice, the safe choice. So why did it feel like the greatest cowardice of his life? For 2 weeks, Knox successfully avoided private encounters with Grace. He sent Miguel to town for supplies, delegated dam oversight to Wilson, and declined invitations to social functions. When unavoidable business brought him into Paso Robles, he timed his visits to avoid school hours. The strategy worked, after a fashion. If he occasionally caught himself staring at the horizon in the direction of Grace's cottage, or if he sometimes dreamed of green eyes and auburn hair, Knox dismissed these lapses as temporary weaknesses to be overcome through discipline and time. Then came the letter. It arrived on a sweltering August morning, delivered by young Tommy Henderson, who had apparently appointed himself Grace's messenger. "Miss Sullivan said to give you this personally, Mr. Blackwell," the boy announced importantly, "and to wait for an answer." Knox recognized Grace's neat handwriting on the envelope. For a moment, he considered returning it unopened, but something pride, perhaps, or a deeper yearning he wouldn't acknowledge made him break the seal. The message was brief and formal. "Mr. Blackwell, your presence is requested at a meeting of the Water Committee this evening at 7 o'clock at the Town Hall. Several technical questions have arisen regarding the dam project that require your expertise. Respectfully, Grace Sullivan, Committee Secretary." No mention of their kiss. No hint of the warmth that had grown between them over the summer. Just a business-like summons that he could neither ignore nor refuse without appearing petty. "Tell Miss Sullivan I'll be there," Knox told Tommy, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. The committee meeting was well attended, with representatives from various parts of town alongside Knox's foreman and the engineer. Grace sat at the end of the table, taking notes with a composure that betrayed nothing of her feelings about Knox's recent absence. The technical questions proved legitimate concerns about water allocation during the upcoming dry season and the timeline for completing the third dam. Knox answered each query thoroughly and professionally, avoiding direct eye contact with Grace while being acutely aware of her presence. As the meeting concluded, Mayor Hollister cleared his throat. One final matter. The town council has approved funds for a celebration upon completion of the final dam, expected in early October. A harvest festival of sorts to commemorate our new partnership with Circle B Ranch. Murmurs of approval circulated around the table. Miss Sullivan has volunteered to chair the planning committee, the mayor continued. Mr. Blackwell, would you be willing to serve as co-chair? It seems only fitting, given your central role in the project. It was a trap, neatly laid and impossible to escape without offending the assembled dignitaries. Knox forced a neutral expression. If Miss Sullivan has no objection, I would be honored. Grace finally met his gaze directly. No objection whatsoever, Mr. Blackwell. The coolness in her tone told Knox everything he needed to know about her feelings regarding his recent withdrawal. He had hurt her, exactly as he'd feared, he would just not in the way he had anticipated. As the meeting dispersed, Knox found himself alone with Grace for the first time since the creek rescue. She was gathering her notes, her movements precise and controlled. "I've been busy with ranch matters," he said awkwardly. "The dam project, spare me your excuses," Grace interrupted, her voice low but intense. "You've been avoiding me. After what happened at the creek, you simply disappeared." Knox stiffened. "It was inappropriate. I took advantage of a moment of heightened emotion." "Is that truly what you believe?" She looked up at him, her green eyes challenging. "That it was merely circumstance, not genuine feeling?" "What I believe isn't relevant," Knox replied stiffly. "Some things are best left unexplored." Grace studied him for a long moment. "You're afraid," she finally said, her tone softening. "Not of me, but of what I make you feel." The accuracy of her assessment struck too close to Knox's carefully guarded truth. "You don't understand," he said tersely. "My father was not you," she finished for him. "And I am not the woman who broke his heart." "Grace, the festival committee will meet next Tuesday at my cottage," she said, reverting to a business-like tone. 7 o'clock, please be prompt." Without waiting for his response, she gathered her papers and left, her back straight and her head held high. Knox remained in the empty meeting room, torn between relief at escaping a deeper conversation and a hollow ache at the distance he had deliberately created between them. For the first time, he wondered if protecting himself from potential pain was worth the very real pain of pushing away the one person who had breached his defenses in years. The festival planning meetings became a weekly ordeal that Knox could neither avoid nor truly embrace. Each Tuesday evening found him at Grace's cottage, surrounded by committee members discussing decorations, music, food, and activities. Grace was unfailingly polite but distant, addressing him directly only when necessary for festival business. Despite himself, Knox found the barrier between them increasingly intolerable. He missed their conversations, her challenging perspectives, the way her smile could brighten a room. More than once, he considered staying after the others had left, trying to explain himself. Each time, pride and fear held him back. Meanwhile, work on the final dam neared completion. The project had transformed the valley's water system, creating a series of controlled reservoirs that would serve both the ranch and town through the coming years. The success had enhanced Knox's reputation throughout the county, bringing business opportunities and invitations to invest in expanding ventures. Yet none of it brought him the satisfaction he had anticipated. Instead, Knox found himself going through motions, his achievements hollow without someone to share them with specifically, without grace to share them with. The revelation came gradually, over long nights alone in his study. Knox Blackwell, who had built his life on the principle that love was weakness, was discovering that the absence of love might be the greatest weakness of all. The Harvest Festival was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. As the day approached, Knox found himself increasingly restless, knowing that once the celebration concluded, he would have no legitimate reason to continue seeing Grace regularly. The thought left him uncharacteristically melancholy. The morning of the festival dawned clear and crisp, promising perfect weather. Knox arrived early to oversee the final setup, watching as townspeople erected booths, strung lanterns, and prepared food for what promised to be the largest celebration in Paso Robles history. Grace appeared mid-morning, directing the schoolchildren who were performing songs to open the festivities. She wore a dress of deep blue that Knox had never seen before, her hair arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful curve of her neck. For a moment, their eyes met across the town square. Grace nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to her students, but that brief connection sent a jolt through Knox that he couldn't ignore. The festival officially began at noon, with Mayor Hollister's speech praising the unprecedented cooperation between town and ranch that had made the dam project possible. Knox stood uncomfortably on the platform as the mayor extolled his generosity and vision. "And now," the mayor concluded, "I invite Mr. Blackwell to cut the ribbon officially opening our Harvest Festival." Mid-applause, Knox stepped forward with the oversized scissors. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, he caught sight of Grace standing at the edge of the crowd. Something in her expression, a mixture of pride and wistfulness, struck him forcefully. In that moment, with clarity that felt almost physical in its intensity, Knox realized he had been wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. Love wasn't weakness. Fear was weakness. He had been afraid not of Grace, but of his own capacity for feeling. In trying to protect himself from potential pain, he had inflicted certain pain on both of them. The realization must have shown on his face, for Grace's expression shifted to one of concern. Knox cut the ribbon mechanically, barely acknowledging the cheers that erupted as the festival officially began. Throughout the afternoon, Knox went through the motions of his duties as co-chair, judging contests and greeting visitors from neighboring communities. All the while, his mind worked feverishly, considering and discarding approaches to Grace. As sunset approached, the festival shifted to its evening phase. Lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the square as a band struck up lively dance tunes. Knox watched as Grace organized children for a maypole dance, her face animated as she instructed them in the steps. When the dance concluded to enthusiastic applause, Knox seized his opportunity. Crossing the square with purpose, he approached Grace as she stood watching the children disperse to their parents. "May I have a word, Miss Sullivan?" he asked formally, aware of curious eyes upon them. She regarded him with guarded expression. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell." Knox led her to a quieter corner of the square, gathering his courage. "The festival is a success," he began awkwardly. "Your planning was meticulous." "Thank you," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "The committee worked very hard." "Grace," Knox said, abandoning formality. "I owe you an apology. Several, in fact." Her expression softened slightly. You do. I've been a coward, he continued, the words coming more easily now that he'd begun. Hiding behind excuses when the truth was that I was afraid. Afraid of what? She asked quietly, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. Of feeling something I swore I never would. Knox took a deep breath. My father's experience taught me that love was a weakness, a vulnerability that could destroy a man. I built my life on that belief. Grace's expression remained neutral, but she didn't turn away. It was enough encouragement for Knox to continue. Then you came to Paso Robles, he said, his voice roughening with emotion. Challenging me, pushing me, showing me another way to see the world. Making me question everything I thought I knew about strength and weakness. And what conclusions have you reached? Grace asked softly. That I was wrong, Knox admitted. Real strength isn't building walls to keep others out. It's having the courage to let someone in despite the risks. He took a step closer. You make me stronger, Grace, not weaker. These past weeks without you have proven that beyond any doubt. Hope flickered in her eyes, but she remained cautious. Those are beautiful words, Knox. But how do I know you won't retreat behind your walls again at the first sign of difficulty? You don't, he acknowledged honestly. I can only promise to try every day to be worthy of your trust. To remember that whatever strength I possess is greater when shared with you than when hoarded for myself. Grace studied him for a long moment, the lanterns casting a warm glow across her features. It won't be easy, she warned. You've built those walls very high. Then help me tear them down, Knox said, taking her hand in his. Not all at once, perhaps, but brick by brick, day by day. A smile finally curved her lips. That sounds suspiciously like a partnership, Mr. Blackwell. The most important one I'll ever enter, he agreed, his heart lightening at her smile. If you'll have me. Instead of answering directly, Grace glanced toward the bandstand where couples were beginning to dance. You once said you don't dance, she recalled. I recall being proved wrong about that too. Her smile broadened. Then perhaps you'd care to be proved wrong again. Taking her hand, Knox led Grace to the dance floor, aware of but no longer concerned by the curious glances and whispered comments their appearance together generated. As the band played a waltz, he drew her into his arms, moving with a confidence he hadn't possessed at their first dance. People are watching, Grace murmured, though she made no attempt to increase the distance between them. Let them watch, Knox replied. I'm done hiding what I feel for you. As they danced beneath the stars, Knox felt the last of his self-imposed barriers beginning to crumble. The man who had once believed that love made men weak was discovering that the right kind of love, honest, principled, and strong, could forge a strength greater than any he had known before. The Harvest Festival marked a turning point not just for Paso Robles' water supply, but for Knox Blackwell's heart. In the months that followed, the town witnessed a remarkable transformation in the once solitary rancher, as he courted Grace Sullivan with a dedication that surprised everyone except those who knew them best. Their courtship was not without challenges. Knox's deeply ingrained habits of self-reliance and emotional reserve didn't vanish overnight. There were arguments and misunderstandings, moments when old fears threatened to resurface. But Grace's patient persistence and Knox's determination to be worthy of her love carried them through the difficult times. By the following spring, the entire valley had bloomed with the effects of the new dam system. Paso Robles thrived with reliable water, and the Circle B Ranch expanded its operations to include orchards and vineyards that promised to become the envy of the county. On a perfect April day, with apple blossoms drifting like snow in the orchard behind the ranch house, Knox and Grace were married in a ceremony that brought together the entire community. The town's children, led by Tommy Henderson, formed a choir that sang as Grace walked toward her waiting groom. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Wilkins commented to Mayor Hollister as they watched Knox place a ring on Grace's finger. "Blackwell was the last man I'd have expected to fall in love. Love has a way of finding even the most resistant hearts," the mayor replied sagely. "Especially when it arrives in the form of the right woman." Indeed, as Knox spoke his vows, those who knew him best could see the profound change in him. The hard edges remained the competence and determination that had built his success, but they were now balanced by a warmth and openness that had once seemed impossible. Grace, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, spoke her own vows with the quiet confidence that had first captured Knox's attention nearly a year before. As she promised to love and honor him through all the seasons of their life together, Knox found himself wondering how he had ever believed that closing his heart was strength. "I was wrong about so many things," Knox told her later that evening as they stood on the porch of the ranch house, now their home, watching the stars emerge above the valley. "But most of all, I was wrong about love." Grace leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. "How so?" "I thought it was a weakness to be avoided at all costs," he said, his voice thoughtful. "My father's example seemed to prove it, but you showed me that real love, the kind built on respect and trust, doesn't diminish a man. It enlarges him." "Your father mistook infatuation for love," Grace observed. "What we have is something different entirely." Knox nodded, drawing her closer. "A partnership. Two people who make each other stronger than either could be alone." As the years passed, that partnership proved itself in countless ways. When drought struck the valley in 1879, Knox and Grace worked together to implement water conservation measures that saved both town and ranch. When economic depression threatened in the early 1880s, their combined ingenuity found new markets for Circle B products, keeping men employed when other ranches failed. They welcomed their first child in 1877, a son they named James, after Grace's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, William, 2 years after that. The children grew up understanding both the value of hard work and the importance of community, lessons their parents taught by example rather than precept. Knox never completely lost the edge that had made him successful, but it was now tempered by the wisdom Grace brought to their partnership. Together, they built not just a prosperous ranch, but a legacy of service to Paso Robles and the surrounding valley. By 1895, 20 years after Grace had first challenged Knox over water rights, the Circle B Ranch had become the centerpiece of a thriving agricultural community. The dam system they had built together had expanded to include innovative irrigation techniques that transformed formerly marginal land into productive fields. On the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, Knox took Grace back to the original dam site, now a picturesque spot where willows trailed their branches in the clear water. "You remember how angry you were with me?" he asked, smiling at the memory. "The imperious schoolteacher, taking me to task for my selfish water usage." Grace laughed, the sound as musical as it had been in her youth, though silver now threaded her auburn hair. "And you were so cold and dismissive. I was determined to break through that arrogant facade." "You succeeded beyond your wildest dreams," Knox acknowledged, taking her hand. At 52, he was still strong and straight, though his hair had gone completely silver. "You saved me from myself, Grace." She squeezed his hand. "We saved each other and built something neither of us could have created alone." Looking out over the valley, they had helped transform the orchards heavy with fruit, the town prospering in the distance, their children growing into adults, They could be proud of Knox Blackwell, reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolated rancher to respected community leader and devoted family man. He had once believed with absolute conviction that love made men weak. Grace had shown him the truth. The right kind of love made men stronger than they ever could be alone. It was a lesson he would carry in his heart through all the seasons of their life together, a truth as clear and life-giving as the water that now flowed freely through Paso Robles Valley, nurturing everything it touched.